In this video, I'd like to give a brief history of the revised Egyptian chronology movement and explain the different methodologies used by 5 different revised chronologies. They represent the various ways to solve what I refer to as the squeeze of dynasties problem. One thing that is virtually common to all revised chronologies is that they place the Exodus at the end of Egypt's Middle Kingdom during Dynasty 13 in the Middle Bronze Age, as opposed to placing it in the Late Bronze Age during either Dynasty 18 or 19, without altering the dating of Egypt's dynasties. The archaeology of the Middle Bronze Age in Egypt and Israel makes a much better fit than the Late Bronze Age, where the Exodus is usually placed. Such a placement calls for a redating of the end of the Middle Kingdom to around 1450 BC, the biblical date for the Exodus. Mainstream Egyptologists and revisionist chronologists roughly all agree on the dates for the 25th dynasty and those dynasties which followed it. Terhaka, the king of Ethiopia mentioned in 2 Kings 19 verse 9, was a pharaoh of the 25th dynasty of Egypt, known as its Ethiopian dynasty. He was a contemporary of the biblical king Hezekiah of the nation of Judah and the Assyrian king Sennacherib. Egyptologists and revisionist chronologists virtually all agree that Terhaka was king not long after 700 BC, as well as agreeing on the dates for the remaining late period dynasties that followed, dynasties 26 to 31. So by placing the Exodus during an earlier dynasty, dynasty 13, than where mainstream Egyptologists would place it, either dynasty 18 or 19, revisionist chronologists have to find a place for at least an additional 4 dynasties to fit in the same period of time between the Exodus and the 25th dynasty around 700 BC. Now in this video we're going to look at 5 revised Egyptian chronologies and look at how each attempts to deal with this logjam of extra dynasties and fit them at the correct period of time according to the evidence of archaeology. Now 4 of them are the best known of the revised chronologies, and I've included one other which has a rather novel solution of taking the best of Velikovsky's views and not separate dynasties 18 and 19 in the way that Velikovsky proposed. These chronologies represent a good spread of the possible ways to try and solve the squeeze of dynasties problem. In the 1950s, Kathleen Kenyon excavated Jericho and came to the conclusion that there was no late Bronze Age city for Joshua to conquer. And from there, a massive wave of skepticism spread across the entire academic world regarding the accuracy of the Exodus story and other stories in the Bible. Ironically, around the same time, a scholar arose who challenged the foundations of the Egyptian chronology and called for a radical change to dates assigned to Egypt's dynasties. That revisionist pioneer was Emanuel Velikovsky, and the book that sparked the revised chronology movement was called Ages and Chaos, that was first published in 1953. Now, during his research, Velikovsky came upon a document called the Ipuwer Papyrus, dated to the end of the Middle Kingdom in Egypt, which describes devastating plagues eerily similar to what is found in the Bible about the plagues of Egypt. Seeing the archaeological problems with placing the Exodus during the Late Bronze Age, he was the first scholar to popularize the belief that the Exodus occurred during the Middle Bronze Age, as has been further promoted in the recent Tim Mahoney documentary Patterns of Evidence. His first book, Revising Egypt's Chronology, Ages and Chaos, covered the period of time from the Exodus to the end of the 18th dynasty in his reconstruction. Now, he published his books out of chronological order. So in chronological order of his reconstruction, the next volume, the Assyrian Conquest, covered the period of time of the Libyan and Ethiopian dynasties and the start of the 19th dynasty. Now, Velikovsky died in 1979, and that particular volume was never published but was later made available online. The rest of the story of Dynasty 19 was covered in his book Rameses II and His Time that was published in 1978. He stunned many people with his view that Dynasty 19 started a little over 150 years after the end of Dynasty 18. The remaining book in his reconstruction of Egypt's timeline was Peoples of the Sea, published in 1977, which placed Ramses III around 800 years later than conventional chronology places him. Now, there was also one other very important chronological work that Velikovsky produced, and that was his unpublished manuscript, The Dark Age of Greece. The next scholar to build on Velikovsky's pioneering efforts was an SDA scholar, Donovan Corville, who in 1971 published his 2-volume work, The Exodus Problem and Its Ramifications. Corville developed a revised chronology for the entire history of Egypt up to the Greek conquest. Donovan Corville supported Velikovsky's reconstruction as outlined in Ages and Chaos, placing the Exodus at the end of the Middle Kingdom, and his placement of the 18th dynasty in line with the first half of the kingdom period of Israel. He also accepted Velikovsky's synchronism of Thutmose III as the biblical Shishak. In 1974, the Society of Interdisciplinary Studies, the SIS, was formed in the United Kingdom by scholars who wished to further Velikovsky's research in both ancient catastrophism and ancient chronology. Among the scholars who made contributions to the SIS journals were British scholars Peter James and David Roll. After initially working together, their views would diverge in relation to the amount of compression of the late New Kingdom period. Peter James would be the first to publish a book on his chronology. His book, Centuries of Darkness, was first published in 1991 and made a major contribution in further documenting the Dark Age gap in Greece, Turkey, and other places. It is believed was artificially created by applying faulty BC dates from Egypt to finds elsewhere in the ancient world. David Roll published his chronology a few years later in 1995 with A Test of Time, which was made into a 3-part television documentary, Pharaohs and Kings, A Biblical Quest, which appeared in 1995 on Channel 4 in the UK. A prequel to A Test of Time, called Legend, the Genesis of Civilization, was published in 1999, covering the ancient world before the Exodus. And he also published From Eden to Exile in 2003. And David Roll also appeared in the 2014 Tim Mahoney documentary film Patterns of Evidence, Exodus. One other revised chronology I wish to include in this video is that of my late friend Dale Murphy from Newcastle in Australia, who has contributed a number of articles to the SIS journals. His chronology has a novel solution of taking the best of Velikovsky's views and not separating dynasties 18 and 19 in time as Velikovsky proposed. Now, I should note that there are other revised chronologies, but these 5 represent a good spread of the different type of solutions offered to the squeeze of dynasties problem. Answers to the big 4 problems I will highlight shortly to determine the best revised chronology amongst these 5 can easily be applied to determine the merits of any other revised chronology that the viewer may run across. Now, the proposed solutions for solving the logjam of fitting in extra dynasties between the Exodus and the late period are as follows. Both Peter James and David Roll retain Manetho's order of dynasties but apply maximum compression. The bulk of the compression comes from reducing the time for the 3rd intermediate period from 400 down to 160 years. Donovan Corville has a very high degree of parallel rule between dynasties 19 and 20 and dynasties 21 through to 25. Emanuel Velikovsky's solution is probably the most radical of the chronologies proposed. He has dynasties Dynasty 18, followed by the Libyan and Ethiopian dynasties 22 to 25, which he assigns the same compression to as Peter James and David Roll. And after those dynasties, he has the start of Dynasty 19. So he separates dynasties 18 and 19 by around about 160 years. He proposes that Dynasty 19 was actually one and the same as Dynasty 26 of the 7th and 6th centuries BC. And Dale Murphy proposes that the Libyan dynasties ruled parallel with the latter half of Dynasty 18, which he believes had 6 extra unrecognized kings, and then it was followed by Dynasty 19, which he starts slightly before and parallel with Dynasty 26. Now let's look at these solutions in a little bit more detail now. David Roll compresses dynasties 21 to 25, that is the Libyan and Ethiopian dynasties, from 400 years down to 160 years. Due to his acceptance of both Manetho's order of dynasties and his view that it would require too much compression to make it work, he does not accept Velikovsky's synchronism of Shishak with Thutmose III of the 18th dynasty. Instead, he equates Shishak with Ramses II, or Ramses the Great, of Dynasty 19. Peter James worked with David Roll on a compression of dynasties 21 to 25 from 400 years down to 160 years. Now you can see above them on this chart here, the major difference between their chronologies is that David Roll has a much more compressed Dynasty 20, which he overlaps considerably with the Libyan dynasties. Peter James no longer agrees with David Roll's major overlap of Dynasty 20 with the Libyan dynasties. As a result, he starts Dynasties 18, 19 and 20 around 100 years earlier than David Roll, and he equates Shishak with Ramses III of Dynasty 20. David Roll starts Dynasty 18 about 350 years later than conventional chronology, while Peter James starts Dynasty 18 about 250 years later than conventional chronology. The next 3 chronologies that we'll look at all start Dynasty 18 about 480 years later than the conventional chronology. Now, Donovan Corville accepted Velikovsky's view that the Hyksos, that is Dynasties 14 to 17, ruled for 400 years. Even though Josephus assigned 511 years to the Hyksos, and Manetho even longer, conventional chronology as well as David Roll only give around 250 years for the length of the Hyksos. Donovan Corville accepts Velikovsky's synchronism of Shishak with Thutmose III of the 18th dynasty. Donovan Corville also compresses the Libyan and Ethiopian dynasties down to a mere 120 years, with them ruling mostly parallel to each other, as well as ruling parallel with most of Dynasties 19 and all of Dynasty 20. Emmanuel Velikovsky believed that the Hyksos, Dynasties 14 to 17, ruled for 400 years for the whole duration of the judges, a period of time nearly twice that assigned to them by Egyptologists and David Roll. Velikovsky felt that Shishak was Thutmose III of the 18th dynasty, based on a wall in the Temple of Karnak that matches well the objects taken from the temple in Jerusalem. He agrees with David Roll and Peter James in assigning around 160 years for the Libyan and Ethiopian dynasties. Velikovsky also places Dynasty 19 following the Libyan and Ethiopian dynasties due to archaeological finds in Turkey that he believes demand a 600-year reduction in the date of Ramses the Great. While some who accept his late placement of Dynasty 19 have them ruling parallel with Dynasty 26, Velikovsky felt that dynasties 19 and 26 were actually one and the same dynasty. Now our last chronology is that of David Dale Murphy, who accepted Velikovsky's view that the Hyksos dynasties 14 to 17 ruled for 400 years, and also his synchronism of Shishak with Thutmose III of the 18th dynasty. Dale Murphy also accepted Velikovsky's view that dynasty 19 ruled 600 years later than the conventional view, though disagreed it was the same as dynasty 26. Now, in order to bridge the gap between dynasty 18 and dynasty 19, for them to rule one after the other, Dale expands dynasty 18 with 6 extra unrecognized kings, so dynasty 18 is immediately followed by dynasty 19. Now, he believed that the Libyans exerted prime rule during the rule of those extra kings. He believes that this happened after Amenemhotep II, who Velikovsky identified as Zerah the Ethiopian, who God defeated in the days of King Asa of Judah. He then has dynasty 19 reasserting primary rule in the days of Thutmose IV, dynasty 18 in the days of Thutmose IV, followed by Amenhotep III, the heretical King Akhenaten, and the famous boy king Tutankhamun or King Tut. Now there are 4 problems that must be solved to determine which of these revised chronologies, or some mix of them, is the best fit for all the archaeological data available. The first of these problems is who was the pharaoh that the Bible identifies as Shishak, who conquered the fortified cities of Judah, captured Jerusalem, and plundered the Temple of Solomon, taking away all of its incredible amount of treasures. Champollion, the Frenchman who deciphered the Rosetta Stone, was eager to find proof of the Bible in archaeology. In his excitement when reading a relief on the outer wall of the Temple of Karnak, he read the name of Shoshenq and felt that he must be Shishak based on a similarity of the names. The relief of Shoshenq I of dynasty 22 was one of cities in the land of Palestine, so it seemed the right fit, and it has ever since has become the major pillar of conventional Egyptian chronology. It was Emanuel Velikovsky and Agents in Chaos who was the first to highlight the problems with this conventional identification, and David Rohl furthered that work in A Test of Time. Now, upon close inspection, the cities on Shoshenq's inscription are virtually all in the northern kingdom of Israel and not the southern kingdom of Judah, which is the complete opposite of the biblical account. Emanuel Velikovsky drew attention to another wall inside the Temple of Karnak, which, according to his forensic study, included items which were a very close match to those items taken from the temple in Jerusalem. The sheer volume of treasure displayed on the wall was just simply breathtaking, and he concluded that the 18th dynasty pharaoh Thutmose III, who commissioned this relief and had expanded the Egyptian empire all the way up to the Euphrates, was the pharaoh that the Bible refers to as Shishak, who plundered the temple in the days of King Solomon's son Rehoboam. David Rohl felt that too much compression was required in the later dynasties to justify such a late date for the 18th dynasty. His candidate for Shishak was Ramses II, who we also know as Ramses the Great of the 19th dynasty. His main archaeological support is a much more modest inscription in the RAMESES, showing that Ramses the Great had indeed been to Jerusalem. Additionally, David Rohl has provided some strong linguistic evidence for the origin of the name Shishak, which he feels is derived from the SES at the end of the name Ramses. Now, it should be noted here that the SES ending is also shared by other pharaohs with the name Rameses as well as Tutmosis. Now, Peter James has advocated that Shishak was probably Ramses III of the 20th dynasty. He has no archaeological support for this, but his chronology places him at the same time as the biblical Shishak. Now for our second problem. We have seen one major example of where the histories of Israel and Egypt intersected with the conquest of Judah by Shishak. Another great opportunity to synchronize the histories of the two lands is available through the AMARNA letters. The heretical late 18th dynasty pharaoh Akhenaten, who was the father of the famous boy king Tutankhamun, as part of his religious reforms, created a new city called HITTITE, which was abandoned soon after his reign. At that site, today called El Amarna, a huge cache of foreign correspondence was found between Egypt and the local rulers in Syria and Palestine, who were under the hegemony of Egypt at that period of time. Now, the conventional chronology used by Egyptologists dates Akhenaten's reign to the time of the judges in Israel during the 1300s BC. If we could find in the Bible's details a match with the details of what is happening in Palestine as seen in the letters, we can find a lock in the Bible timeline for the late 18th dynasty. Velikovsky, based on the details in the letters, made a case that the letters were written during the middle of the kingdom period in Israel, around the time of Ahab and Jehoshaphat nearly 500 years later. Peter James in 1978 wrote an article on the AMARNA letters, arguing that Velikovsky placed the time in Israel contemporary with Akhenaten a generation too early. In my opinion, he made a stronger case than Velikovsky that it was contemporary with Ahab and Jehoshaphat's sons, Joram and Jehoram, rather than Ahab and Jehoshaphat themselves. Now, Peter James abandoned this view when he felt that too much compression was required in the later dynasties to justify such a late date for the 18th dynasty, and he now places the time of the AMARNA letters in the time of the late judges around 1100 BC. David Roll places the time of the letters in the time of Saul and David, when they were expanding their control over other inhabitants of the land. One of the correspondents loyal to Pharaoh in the letters was Abdi Heber of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is easily identified as Jerusalem, and this provides a potential anachronism for both the conventional view and both David Roll and Peter James. Now, prior to David capturing Jerusalem, the city was known as Jebus. The name Jerusalem is used in the book of Joshua, but is the name an alternate name that was used for Jebus, or is the reference prior to David's conquest merely an editorial redaction as implied in Joshua 18 verse 28? Now, because Dale Murphy slots his extra 6 18th dynasty pharaohs before the time of Akhenaten, he places the time of the AMARNA letters around 130 years later than Velikovsky does, in the time of Ahaz of Judah, that's Hezekiah's father, and the time of Pekah, one of the last kings of Israel before their conquest and exile at the hands of the Assyrians. Now, if we can find in the Bible's details a match with the details of what is happening in Palestine as seen in the AMARNA letters, we can find a lock in the Bible timeline for the late 18th dynasty. And the third great problem to resolve is just when did Ramses the Great rule? Peter James places him around 1000 BC, around the time of Saul and David. David Roll identifies Ramses the Great as the biblical Shishak, who plundered the Temple of Solomon in Rehoboam's reign. And the main problem for this placement is that he and his father Seti the Great, or Seti the First, had a major military base at Bethshan in northern Israel. Now, this may not be a problem in the time of Solomon's reign if this was a base of an ally, but victory stealers of both kings are found there, implying conquest in the area, which is a clear anachronism with the time of the powerful empire of King Solomon. Donovan Corville places Rameses the Great in the time of Uzziah of Judah and Jeroboam II of Israel, which poses much the same problem. Israel and Judah flourished at the time of those kings and greatly expanded, recovering much lost territory. The Egyptian military base at Bethshan, with its victory stealers of Seti I and Ramses II, aren't a good fit for the time of these kings in the land of Israel either. And after those kings, it is just as much a problem as the Assyrians have made Israel a vassal state at that time and taken away captive the tribes on the eastern side of the Jordan. Corville also identifies Ramses the Great as the biblical King So, that Hoshea of Israel paid tribute to before the Assyrians laid siege to Samaria. Emanuel Velikovsky and Dale Murphy place Ramses the Great much later as a contemporary with Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. They identify him as the biblical Necho who fought the Battle of Carchemish. Ramses the Great made a peace treaty with the Hittite king Hattusilus III, one of the last Hittite kings. And it is from this treaty that the Hittite Empire gets its BC dates from. And because Ramses the Great is thought to have reigned around 1250 BC, the fall of the Hittite Empire is placed usually soon after 1200 BC. The archaeological finds, however, at Hittite sites strongly imply that this date is centuries too early. The Hittite finds at these sites would be dated 600 years later if it were not for the conventional date for Ramses the Great's reign being applied to date Hittite finds. The fourth and most vexing of the problems to resolve to determine the best revised chronology is whether the Libyan and Ethiopian dynasties, also known as the Third Intermediate Period, ruled in between dynasties 18 and 19, as proposed by Emanuel Velikovsky. I say it is the most vexing of the four problems because, on the surface, the evidence marshalled by both sides appears to be contradictory. One set of evidence must not be the smoking gun that it appears to be. Velikovsky relied on what I refer to as synchronistic evidence to make his case. That is, evidence synchronizing events in Egypt with those in other nations, such as the Hittite Empire, as well as Syria and Israel. The other revisionists, in particular Peter James and David Roll, put the greatest weight on connecting evidence, mainly from Egypt, showing Dynasty 18 was immediately followed by Dynasty 19. Now, this is a little unusual in Peter James's case, as his book Centuries of Darkness focused heavily on the Dark Age problem, where he gave numerous examples of dating gaps that were mostly 400 plus years, yet he offers the most conservative reduction of dates for the New Kingdom of only 250 years. David Roll offers a greater reduction of dates for the New Kingdom of about 350 years due to some overlap of Dynasty 20 with the Libyan dynasties. His chronological works have much less focus on the Dark Age problem than Peter James and Emanuel Velikovsky. Both Donovan Corville and Dale Murphy have Dynasty 19 immediately following Dynasty 18, but have much more overlap between them and the dynasties of the Third Intermediate Period. Now, there are a few items of evidence used in particular by Peter James and David Roll, amongst others, to rebut Emanuel Velikovsky's view that Dynasty 19 came after the Libyan and Ethiopian dynasties, which came after Dynasty 18. And the first comes from a synchronism between the AMARNA letters and the Hittite Empire. One of the AMARNA letters from the late 18th dynasty speaks of a Superlulamus who is believed to be the Superlulamus I of the new Hittite Empire. The second king after Superlulamus I was Muwatalus III, and he was the Hittite king who fought against Rameses II of the 19th dynasty in the famous Battle of Kadesh. The validity of this item of evidence comes down to proving whether or not the Superlulamus mentioned in the AMARNA letter was Superlulamus I of the new Hittite Empire. The next item of evidence is genealogical evidence. There are Egyptian high priest genealogies that show support for the Manetho order of dynasties, and also very close proximity of Dynasty 19 following Dynasty 18. These genealogies were compiled many centuries after Dynasty 19 reigned. So, is the content in these genealogies genuine and consistent with other evidence we know from the period in question, or are these artificial creations that are untrustworthy? The third item of evidence is pottery evidence, where Greek Mycenaean pottery of the late Bronze Age is found in levels assigned to Dynasty 19. Late Helladic 3B pottery is found immediately above late Helladic 3A pottery, which was found in abundance at AMARNA, the short-lived late 18th dynasty capital. It is believed that there is a secure connection between late Helladic 3B pottery with Dynasty 19, proving it shortly followed Dynasty 18. Now, the connection between late Helladic 3A pottery and Dynasty 18 is very solid, given the abundance of it found at AMARNA. But just how solid is the connection between late Helladic 3B and Dynasty 19? And one very interesting point brought to attention by Alan Montgomery, who supports Velikovsky's placement of the dynasties, is that the prenomen name of Ramses the Great, Usamatre Setepenre, is the same prenomen name used by Libyan dynasty pharaohs Ossikorn II and Shoshenq III. So, have scarabs found with that prenomen name been incorrectly assigned to Ramses the Great? And does this impact on the connection between late Helladic 3B pottery with Dynasty 19? The last piece of evidence highlighted by David Roll comes from the Bubastite portal at the Temple of Karnak. Architectural evidence at the Bubastite portal in the Temple of Karnak is used to support the view that Ramses II of Dynasty 19 ruled before Shoshenq I of the 22nd dynasty, and that the Libyan dynasties did not rule in between dynasties 18 and 19. How accurate is the interpretation from this site regarding which dynasty ruled before the other? Now, the evidence for the separation of dynasties 18 and 19, with the third intermediate period falling in between, gets its main support from a careful analysis of the Dark Ages in Greece and Turkey, and in particular the difference in dating gaps between the two regions. Now, Greece gets its absolute BC dates from a synchronism with Dynasty 18. The Hittite sites of Turkey get their absolute BC dates from a synchronism with Dynasty 19. The difference in the amount of years between these two dating gaps of these two regions is quite significant and beneficial in determining if there was any time that intervened between dynasties 18 and 19. Archaeologists in excavating sites across Greece and Western Turkey, such as the traditional site of Troy, believe that there was a Dark Age gap of some 400 to 500 years following the fall of the Mycenaean civilization. Mycenaean pottery is assigned a date several hundred years before the next Greek civilization appears, that is the archaic age of Homer. The reason for this is due to the synchronism of the time of Akhenaten of the 18th dynasty with Mycenae, as there was a tremendous amount of Mycenaean pottery found at his capital AMARNA in Egypt. In his article Greek Pottery, Dark Ages and Egyptian Chronology, Alan Montgomery writes the following about this Dark Age gap in Greek archaeology. He writes, Tor, a Greek archaeologist, pointed out that when Petrie applied his dates to Mycenaean pottery, it created a huge 500-year archaeological gap. Formerly, the dates of the Mycenaean period, circa 1000 to 700 BC, allowed continuity with an even overlap of the geometric period. Petrie's dates pushed back the Mycenaean era to 1450 to 1200 BC, but without providing history or material culture to fill this empty gap. This empty gap became known as the Greek Dark Age. The Greek Dark Age was not like the Dark Ages after the fall of the Roman Empire, during which only a little of the history and material culture is known. The Greek Dark Age lacks any history or material culture at all. Furthermore, the culture of the 7th century archaic period is clearly derived from the Mycenaean age. In central and southern Turkey, where the Hittite Empire ruled, the Dark Age dating gap is consistently found to be over 600 years, and this is due solely to dating the treaty of the 19th dynasty pharaoh Rameses the Great with the Hittites to the 1200s BC. Ekrem Erkigal writes the following about the area ruled by the Hittites in today's nation of Turkey. Despite all industrious archaeological exploration of the last decades, the period from 1200 to 750 for most parts of the Anatolian region lies still in complete darkness. Now, what is particularly curious is that in northern Syria are the Neo-Hittite city-states that are contemporary with the Assyrian Empire at its peak. They exhibit a material culture that is almost identical with the Hittite Empire that supposedly fell some 500 years earlier. So, has the Imperial Hittite Empire been dated centuries earlier than it should have been? Did it rule over and at the same time as the later Neo-Hittite city-states of Syria much later in time? And how does this impact on our dating of Ramses the Great and the 19th dynasty? One example of the problems caused by applying Egypt's absolute BC dates to finds in Greece and Western Turkey can be found at the site traditionally believed to be the site of Troy. Between levels 8 and 7b was found a destruction layer of fire. Above it was found Greek late geometric pottery dating from the 600s BC. Below it was late Helladic 3b pottery of the Mycenaean period, usually dated to 1200 BC. It is believed that the site was abandoned for centuries before being inhabited again. And this is the typical way that sites are interpreted in Greece and Western Turkey. That said, there are major anomalies at the site. The first is that the grey minion ware found in the levels of the Mycenaean period below the destruction level is also found above the destruction level with no apparent change hundreds of years later. The second major anomaly is that the Greek late geometric pottery dating from the 600s BC is also found below the destruction level in level 7b. In Hittite sites, we find even more and stranger anomalies. The strangest comes from the city of Gordian, which gives its name to the tale of the Gordian knot, which the problems of revised chronology can be likened to. Its top strata contain Persian artifacts, and we know from history that the Persians conquered Gordian in 548 BC. The third stratum down was identified as belonging to the Phrygians and dated to the 8th century BC. The Phrygian kingdom came to an end when the Sumerians attacked it in 687 BC. So this leaves the second stratum sandwiched neatly between these two precise dates, 687 and 548 BC. Now this second stratum turned out to be a conundrum, as it contained a copious amount of Hittite pottery and telltale pictographic hieroglyphics. At Hattusa, the capital of the Imperial Hittite Empire, in the top stratum, level 1, archaeologists found late Phrygian and post-Phrygian ceramics together with Greek language inscriptions, evidence of the 7th and 6th centuries BC. There were also Hittite seals. In the next stratum, level 2, they found much Hittite pottery and Hittite seals with pictographic hieroglyphics of the Hittite Empire. And this was evidence of the 13th century. But there was also East Greek pottery found in the houses of level 2. Among the 13th century Hittite items, there was pottery which could not be dated earlier than the 8th and 7th centuries BC. Now, what evidence caused the archaeologists to date the Hittite Empire to the 13th centuries in defiance of how the data would be read in the normal archaeological way? Well, the sole reason for this date was the treaty signed between Hattusa III and Rameses II of the 19th dynasty of Egypt. Egyptian chronology places Rameses II firmly in the 13th century. Now, Gordian, read in the normal archaeological way, calls for a revision of the date of Ramses the Great by some 600 plus years. Now let me clarify something regarding the Dark Ages of these regions and dating gaps. Now the Dark Age gap in Turkey is the same as in Greece, from 1200 to 700 BC. Now the difference in Turkey are the dating gaps, which are 150 years greater. Now a dating gap is where the usual archaeological context implies one date, that is contemporary with the late Assyrian Empire as one example, yet the dating applied is centuries older. For example, Imperial Hittite items are given an absolute BC date worked out from the synchronism of the Hittite treaty with Ramses the Great. In Greece and Western Turkey, the Dark Age gap is consistently found to be around 450 to 500 years, which matches how far out the 18th dynasty dating is according to Velikovsky's synchronism of Thutmose III with the biblical Shishak. In central Turkey and Syria, the Dark Age dating gap is consistently found to be over 600 years, and this is due solely to dating the treaty of the 19th dynasty pharaoh Ramses the Great with the Hittites to the 1200s BC. Now the difference in these dating gaps in Greece and Turkey of around 150 years, where one area obtains its absolute BC dates due to the conventional dating of the 18th dynasty, and the other due to the conventional dating of the 19th dynasty, can be explained if the two dynasties were separated by around 150 years, as argued by Velikovsky. Now, ironically, Velikovsky, Peter James, and David Roll all agree on the length of time that should be assigned to the third intermediate period when the Libyan and Ethiopian dynasties ruled. Now let's look at what happens to the Dark Age gap when we apply the various revised chronologies to it. Now, Peter James places the end of the Late Bronze Age around 950 BC. Now this only half closes the Dark Age gap to only 200 years. David Roll's date of 850 BC for the end of the Late Bronze Age still leaves a 100-year gap when applied to the archaeology of Greece, which, relatively speaking, almost closes the gap. However, in the Hittite Empire, his 350-year reduction of Egypt's New Kingdom dates still leaves a dating gap of around 300 years. And the chart on the right here shows the chronologies of Greece and Turkey when the Dark Ages are removed as per Velikovsky's chronology. So you see here the Mycenaean Age is followed immediately by Homer's Archaic Age, and the Hittite Empire is simultaneous with the time of the Neo-Hittite period of the North Syrian city-states. Now, why is it important which revised chronology best fits the archaeological evidence? Well, here is an example of how the different chronological views impact the interpretation of archaeological evidence in the land of Israel. There is agreement amongst archaeologists that the late Bronze Age gap was a period of prosperity in the land, and then when it transitions to the Iron Age, there is a sudden drop in the material culture, and the evidence shows that the land was much poorer in the Iron Age. There is also there's evidence of great destruction at the transition at this particular time. Now, the conventional chronology places the start of the Iron Age around 1200 BC. So this evidence is interpreted as evidence for the time of when Israel conquered the land and dispossessed the Canaanites, who were much richer than the poor Israelites. The destruction of this time is usually interpreted as either the conquest by the Israelites or the destruction caused by the Sea Peoples, who are often identified as the Philistines. And David Roll places the end of the Late Bronze Age around 850 BC, and he interprets this evidence as the time of the Syrian incursions by Ben-Hadad and Hazael into the Israelite tribal lands on the eastern side of the Jordan, where many refugees would have fled west into Israel's hill country. Emanuel Velikovsky places the end of the Late Bronze Age around 750 BC. Now, archaeologists are aware of a massive collapse of civilization around the entire eastern Mediterranean, and evidence of great earthquakes in Greece and Turkey at the end of the Late Bronze Age. Velikovsky's revised date for this collapse of around 750 BC puts it at the same time as the great earthquake of Uzziah spoken of in the Bible. And Josephus says at this time that a mountain near Jerusalem split and half of it moved nearly half a mile, would you believe? Now, Israel was expanding and very prosperous prior to 750 BC in the time of the reigns of Uzziah in Judah and Jeroboam II in Israel. But from around 750 BC, in addition to Uzziah's earthquake, the Assyrians took the tribes east of the Jordan into exile, and the land plunged into a much poorer state, as reflected in the Iron Age pottery finds. So, in conclusion, the best way to determine which is the best revised chronology to fit the archaeological evidence, one must resolve 4 problems. 1. Who was Shishak? 2. When in Israel's history were the AMARNA letters written? 3. When did Rameses the Great reign? And 4. Did the Libyan and Ethiopian dynasties rule in between the 18th and 19th dynasties? Solve those 4 problems and you'll be able to determine which is the best revised chronology. Now, thank you for watching. If you have any further comments or questions, please feel free to contact me by emailing me at rogwaite@gmail.com, and I hope that you found this video helpful.